Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. April 12th is one of those dates where history stops pretending to be a clean, orderly process and just starts throwing bricks through the window. Empires hand off power like family businesses with swords. Kings switch religions after deciding their old gods have terrible customer service. Revolutions inch toward independence, and humanity keeps finding new ways to launch itself into the sky while somehow remaining emotionally the same insecure little species. So tonight, let's walk through a day that gave us collapsing Romes, rising Napoleons, vaccine miracles, civil rights courage, and enough irony to keep a political comedian employed for centuries. Segment 1: Empires, Successions, and Other Family Disasters. On April 12, 240, Shapur I became co-emperor of the Sasanian Empire, which was basically Ardashir I saying, "Son, I built this empire. Now come learn how to menace Rome professionally." And Shapur did not treat that as an internship. He went on to become one of Rome's worst nightmares, eventually capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian alive, which is the ancient world equivalent of hacking the Pentagon and then making the defense secretary carry your groceries. A couple centuries later, on April 12, 467, Anthemius was elevated to Western Roman emperor as the East's last serious attempt to keep the West from becoming a historical yard sale. Constantinople sent over a polished aristocrat with military credentials and hope in his luggage. But the West was already running on fumes, assassination, and Germanic generals with main character energy. Anthemius even married his daughter to Ricimer to hold the alliance together, which in Roman politics meant they were only about 6 months from trying to kill each other. He was eventually beheaded by that same son-in-law, because late Rome wasn't an empire anymore. It was a Thanksgiving dinner with siege weapons. April 12th keeps reminding us that succession plans look elegant in ceremony and absolutely feral in practice. Segment 2: Faith, Food, and Medieval Public Relations. April 12th also belonged to people trying to hold society together with religion, ritual, and a frankly alarming amount of spectacle. In ancient Rome, the Cerealia festival kicked off with games, sacrifices, and public performances dedicated to Ceres, goddess of grain. Because when your empire depends on bread, the harvest isn't just agriculture, it's national security. Politicians used the festival to hand out food and curry favor, which means Roman democracy was already experimenting with subsidized snacks and theatrical distraction. And then there was the fox ritual, where live foxes reportedly had torches tied to their tails and were released into the Circus Maximus. That is either sacred symbolism or the exact moment a civilization starts losing the plot. Then, in 627, King Edwin of Northumbria converted to Christianity on Easter Day, April 12th. After surviving an assassination attempt and deciding maybe the old gods weren't really moving with urgency. Best of all, one of his pagan priests publicly concluded the old religion had poor returns on investment, grabbed a spear, and helped destroy his own temple. That is not a conversion. That is a Yelp review. And in 1012, Duke Uldric of Bohemia deposed and blinded his brother Jaromir, because medieval politics had all the tenderness of a bear trap. Blinding him wasn't random cruelty alone, it was policy. A ruler had to be physically whole, so Uldric turned dynastic rivalry into bureaucratic mutilation. History often tells us religion and legitimacy were sacred. April 12th reminds us they were also brutally practical. Segment 3: Holy Wars, National Symbols, and Revolutionary Nerve. By the High Middle Ages and early modern era, April 12th becomes a masterclass in how noble ideals are very often just ambition wearing better fabric. In 1204, Crusaders breached the walls of Constantinople, turning a campaign supposedly meant to defend Christianity into one of history's most infamous acts of Christian-on-Christian looting. The Fourth Crusade began as a mission to the Holy Land and somehow ended with Venice helping redirect the whole thing toward a rival city full of gold, relics, and opportunity. It's the medieval version of a charity road trip ending in Grand Theft Cathedral. The sack crippled Byzantium for generations and proved that when money and ideology get into the same wagon, ideology usually gets tossed out first. Then, in 1606, James I approved the first Union flag, combining England and Scotland into one maritime symbol. It was a bold piece of branding for two kingdoms that still had separate governments but needed a shared logo. Basically, Britain invented the multinational merger flag before it had the paperwork sorted out. Wales, of course, got folded invisibly into England, which feels very on brand for several centuries of British administrative confidence. And then, in 1776, North Carolina adopted the Halifax Resolves, becoming the first colony to formally authorize its delegates to support independence. Before Jefferson got poetic, these delegates got practical. They weren't writing inspirational posters, they were authorizing treason against the most powerful empire on earth. Revolution always sounds glorious in hindsight. In the moment, it looks a lot like a room full of nervous people deciding whether they're brave or just already too committed to back out. Segment 4, Gunpowder, Glory, and Nations Catching Fire. If you want April 12th at its most explosive, literally and politically, the 19th century delivers. In 1796, Napoleon won the Battle of Montenotte, his first major victory as an army commander, using speed and aggression to split Austrian and Piedmontese forces before they could unite. His troops were starving, underpaid, and barely equipped, which meant Napoleon's pitch was essentially, "Follow me, and there may be food on the other side of these mountains." It worked disturbingly well, which was Europe's first hint that this wiry little artillery officer might become everyone's long-term administrative problem. Then, in 1807, the Froberg Mutiny on Malta ended when desperate mutineers blew up Fort Ricasoli rather than surrender. That is how bad British recruitment conditions had become. Men were deceived into service, brutalized, cornered, and then chose self-detonation over military justice. It is a reminder that empires love to talk about discipline after they've already spent years manufacturing despair. And at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter, turning American political breakdown into full military reality. The strange detail is that no one died in the bombardment itself, making the opening of the Civil War weirdly bloodless right up until it became unimaginably bloody. Charleston's elites watched from rooftops like they had tickets to a fireworks show, because history's first great tragedy is often that people mistake catastrophe for theater. Sumter was the moment the argument stopped being theoretical. The nation had spent months pretending the crisis could be negotiated forever. The cannons announced that denial had officially left the building. Segment 5, Ideologies, Machines, and the Shape of the Modern World. The 20th century on April 12th swings wildly between innovation and atrocity, which is honestly the century's whole brand. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek's forces and allied gangsters launched the Shanghai Massacre, purging communists and labor organizers in a wave of bloodshed that shattered the alliance between the nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party. It was one of those horrifying moments where a government decides that criminal syndicates are a useful administrative partner, which never leads anywhere stable. The purge helped drive the surviving communists into the countryside, where Mao and others would rebuild around peasant revolution instead of urban labor. So yes, one massacre helped reroute the ideological future of the world. Then in 1937, the first successful aircraft jet engine test proved that humans were about to get much faster at crossing the planet and, naturally, much faster at bombing each other. That breakthrough happened while plenty of officials were still thinking in terms of propellers and old war models, because bureaucracies are always preparing for the last disaster while engineers are busy inventing the next one. April 12th also gave us Franklin Roosevelt's death in 1945, a moment that left a war-torn nation grieving and handed Harry Truman a presidency full of world-altering decisions he had barely been briefed on. And in 1955, the Salk polio vaccine was declared safe and effective, prompting nationwide celebration. Imagine a scientific announcement so joyous that church bells ring, parents cry, and the whole country briefly remembers public health is not tyranny. That day, science didn't just win an argument. It gave millions of children back their future. Segment 6, Space, Conscience, and the Strange Theater of Modern Prestige. April 12th closes by looking upward and inward at the same time. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting Earth in 108 minutes and returning as a Soviet icon. After a re-entry so chaotic, it sounds less like triumph and more like surviving a very expensive blender. The first man in space landed in a field and had to reassure local farmers that no, he was not an alien, just a Soviet citizen who needed a phone. It is one of history's greatest endings. Humanity crosses the cosmic threshold, then immediately asks for directions. 2 years later, on April 12, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham. And from that jail cell came one of the most powerful moral arguments ever written in American history. King took the accusation that his protests were untimely and turned it into a devastating indictment of moderation without justice. If Gagarin showed how high humans could rise physically, King showed how high conscience could rise under pressure. Then, on April 12, 1981, Columbia launched on the first space shuttle mission, tying the date back to Gagarin and announcing a new era of reusable spacecraft. It was bold, hopeful, and very American. Take a miracle, make it operational, give it a budget problem. And in 1988, The Last Emperor swept the Oscars, while in 1992, Euro Disney opened outside Paris, proving that by the late 20th century, empire came in many forms: rockets, films, ideology, civil rights, and occasionally a mouse trying to sell France on the magic of corporate fantasy. History doesn't move in one direction. It expands, collides, and then sells souvenirs. In conclusion, April 12th is a date where power gets transferred, challenged, weaponized, moralized, and occasionally launched into orbit. It gave us emperors trying to stabilize the world, conquerors accelerating chaos, revolutionaries authorizing the unthinkable, scientists saving children, civil rights leaders redefining justice, and astronauts proving that the sky was no longer a ceiling. What ties it all together is not progress in a straight line, but pressure. Political pressure, moral pressure, military pressure, technological pressure. And under that pressure, people reveal who they are. Sometimes they become tyrants. Sometimes they become visionaries. Sometimes they invent jet engines, vaccines, or letters that outlive prisons. And sometimes they build Euro Disney, and France has to negotiate with Goofy. That, more than anything, is why history matters. Not because it is neat, but because it is gloriously human.